All right, we got something a little bit different on the podcast today, and I'm also doing this intro from a hotel lobby, so you may hear some background noise from other conversations or children running around or morning hotel patrons chugging coffee, all that kind of good stuff. But on this episode, I have a conversation with my childhood friend, John Friel, and we get into some stuff about health and fitness that isn't necessarily what we tend to talk about on the podcast, right? It's not as much about optimizing performance or dealing with high-level athletes or the intricacies of how you take someone from, the 99.9th percentile to the 99.99th percentile, but really, why would someone care about health? Why would they care about working out? Why would they care about all that kind of stuff if their primary goals are longevity or something like mental acuity and ability to focus for long amounts of time? And we kind of break some of that stuff down, which I really enjoy this conversation in the sense that John is a very curious and intelligent person, but doesn't necessarily have an expertise in training. So to get questions from him about, why does this stuff matter? How does one actually think about this? How do you make good decisions? And how do you actually filter the torrent of information that is kind of unleashed upon us every day by the internet? I think is a pretty valuable discussion. So I really enjoyed this one. Let me know if you enjoyed it as well, since this is, again, not the normal format that we kind of run through on these things. And if you liked it, we can keep doing stuff like this every once in a while. So check it out. Let me know if you enjoy.
Oh, nervous. Do you have stage fright?
Yeah, actually.
Do you have a podcast, right?
Well, we're finding out right now.
Okay. Well, in spite of your fear, we will just jump into it. So here's what's happening today. We have myself and we have my friend John Friel, who we've been friends since second grade. How did we actually meet?
What I remember is being at base maybe, or sure. Maybe recess.
Yes. Base is before and after school experience for children with working parents who are untrusted to be unsupervised on their own.
I have this specific memory of you dribbling a soccer ball and me saying, "Hey, you're that Todd kid, right?" And you saying, "Yeah, you're that John kid, right?" Which is just like a funny phrasing.
Yeah,
to
it's
me.
really weird.
Like a strange, like that. Right, a strange child way of speaking where you're like, I don't know, trying to sound assured.
Well, there you go. Okay, so before and after school experience, and we often have dense theoretical discussions on a variety of topics. So we figured we would record one of those. This time we'll talk about fitness, since that's a thing that I allegedly know about and John has questions about, which is actually really interesting since John is not really involved in the fitness industry at all, but is an intelligent person who is curious. So we'll kind of see what happens. So John came prepared with a Google Doc full of questions. He's nervous about asking them, but we're just gonna kind of go for it and see what actually happens here. So what do you want to talk about first?
Yeah. So I think an angle that is potentially interesting is that I'm pretty much an outsider to your world. And I think probably most of your episodes are pretty in the weeds. And things I wonder about are like almost lowercase p philosophical. So if I'm someone who, say doesn't care that much about body image and I don't have a sport that I want to excel at, I probably do subconsciously care about body image, whatever, if I tell myself I don't. So I would maybe be inclined normally to think of health and fitness as being a thing that makes me better at one of those two things. Like it's not a thing unto itself. Like I get more healthy and fit so that I can be better at football or basketball or whatever, or I get more healthy and fit so that I look better naked or feel better about myself or whatever, right? But if we're thinking about health and fitness as just things unto themselves, what would they refer to?
Yeah, sure. Well, so I think that within the CrossFit community, there is the foundational article that really put CrossFit on the map that Greg Glassman wrote, where he's the article is titled "What is Fitness?" And it actually gives a definition to fitness in terms of the ability to move large loads long distances quickly, which is like a very mathematical definition of essentially someone's capacity to do work over time, right? Which I think is valuable to sort of understand stuff from that perspective.
Yeah, I think maybe I would want to rephrase my question.
Oh, sure, yeah, but I was going to say that, but that's not what you're asking,
right?
Right, like you can give a definition of what is fitness, but I think your question is more. To what end would someone care about fitness? Is that more along the lines that you're going with?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Why is it valuable?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, like you mentioned, there's a lot of people for whom fitness is something that gives them, an improved body image that they care about. People want to beat other people in specific sports. People want to just beat other people in fitness competitions, right? Like just, okay, I want to lift more weight than you or go faster than you on all this kind of stuff. But for a lot of people, they just don't care about that at all. It's just like totally irrelevant. I do think that sort of gamification aspect of fitness stuff is very helpful for motivation for some types of people, but for others, it can almost be a turnoff. It's like,
yeah, I mean, I think competitiveness is probably like a dimension along which people's personalities vary, right? And I'm personally just not a very competitive person. At least regarding
in some stuff. Yeah, in some stuff. Yeah, right. So I do think that I think people have varying degrees of competitiveness, but also different things that they're competitive about. And that kind of like
that's totally true.
Physical domination of other males might not be something that you care at all about. But right, I mean, you do care about like intellectual sparring and stuff like that as well. And I think there can be an element of that type of thing with like various fitness and sports too.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But to not get too far off track from your actual question, I think that essentially fitness is for someone who doesn't care about like having 6-pack abs or like setting a back squat PR or whatever. It's essentially a tool, right? It facilitates you being able to do other stuff that you care about doing, and that's not always physical. That there is, obviously the like the health benefits of training, right? Where it's like, well, you don't want to get diabetes, which like ruins your life, so work out, right? Like there's that sort of like long in the future, you could have some potentially life ruining event by not being fit. And that's also not terribly motivating for people, right? People kind of know that and they're like, yeah, whatever, like leave me alone. But what I think is more relevant is the actual like capacity you have to do the stuff that you want to do on a daily basis, which for a lot of people is not just, I want to be able to walk up and down stairs without getting out of breath, right? Like, I mean, again, that's kind of like a nice thing to have, but the actual sort of like functional capacity to process information, like think about stuff, I think that being fit does benefit that. So for most people, probably listening to this podcast, the assumption is, that you are someone who consumes a lot of information for a living and sort of spits it out in a different way, whether that's emails or Excel spreadsheets or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that being fit as a whole will make you better at doing that, right? That you have, improved ability to kind of like learn and acquire new skills and process information and actually retain memories and all that kind of stuff from training. There's actually some pretty good research on all that kind of stuff. So it's sort of like, go ahead.
The thing that I've been telling myself about why it's important for someone like me to stay at least nominally fit is that I think of, say, like mood and alertness as being these sort of like ambient things that underlie the other cognitive things you do in your life, and that they could make all those things go just like a little bit better, right? So even just like interacting with people, but also doing knowledge work and thinking about how to build a thing or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say that the I think a lot about the concept of energy throughout the day, right? Which probably is close to what you're referring to with alertness, where a lot of people talk about managing time, which is relevant, but I think managing energy is just as important, if not more important. So I think that you do have at some level a limited amount of cognitive energy that you can spend on a given day. There's obviously a lot of factors that go into that, but you can only expect to do a certain amount of quality work per day, right?
Yeah.
And that being fit, I think, increases the amount of energy that you potentially have to devote to various activities, right? And then you kind of end up with this trade-off. Well, okay, you have to spend some of your cognitive energy to get yourself to the gym and actually train, all that kind of stuff. But just like you can train your capacity to do more work in like a workout, I think you can train your capacity to have more cognitive energy throughout the day, and sort of like a baseline of health is important for that. But then also just the training of, okay, this is hard and I don't really want to do it, but I'm able to kind of like zone out distractions and get it done, I think actually does improve the overall ability of people to focus and get stuff done. Right. So I look at it for someone in your situation as, okay, how can you increase the overall bucket size of energy that you have to sort of distribute where you want throughout the day? And is that potential increase in bucket size greater than the amount that you'd have to spend on fitness? And I would say absolutely yes. Right. And it is something you can trade off a little bit. I know for myself, it can feel good to not work out for like a week and actually get a lot more stuff done. I'm like, oh man, this is great. I can finish all this extra stuff. But then I definitely, at least personally, start to notice like change in mood and ability to sleep and all that kind of stuff if I'm not training consistently. And I know I know I'm someone who's sensitive to that, right? That I tend to go in like a more depressive direction if I'm not exercising regularly. And that's been something I've been aware of, for like 15 years or so, where it's like, oh, if I work out, I like don't have teen angst anymore. This is great.
Right. Yeah, totally. I had that same experience. Okay. So, I mean, that's super interesting. And I think does a pretty good job of answering my question. I wonder if, so like I have a pretty good intuitive sense of what we're talking about when we say energy, right? Like, I guess it's the feeling of alertness and motivation to do whatever your things are for the day. Is that a thing that you think could be defined more specifically? Or
yeah.
I mean, is it worth trying to do that? I mean, we're not neuroscientists or whatever.
Yeah, right. I mean, I would say that, if we're going to try to define it, it's kind of just winging it. But I definitely think that, at least for myself, I think of energy in like a few different buckets also, right? That there's probably some sort of bigger picture cognitive processing that's like, okay, do the thing that you're supposed to do that you don't necessarily want to do, like in the moment, right? Like how strong is your prefrontal cortex to kind of overcome something to make you do something, right? That's probably
that's totally a thing. Willpower.
Yeah, right. But I also think that, if we sort of zoom out from that a little bit, I think the energy to do different types of tasks is also variable. And I think that Dan Pink actually has a new book on this that I haven't read, but I heard an interview with him that was pretty interesting where he was essentially talking about ideal times of day to do certain types of tasks, right? That some types of tasks are more like big picture thinking and creative. Some types of tasks are much more like detail focused and all that kind of stuff. And that there's also not necessarily an optimal time to do all types of work, even though they might be hard, right? That I know that I personally do well in the morning with more, I guess, kind of like challenging and like detail focused tasks where I sort of have to, say mess around with software or like write computer code or be not totally creative, but like something like that where you have to kind of like connect the dots on stuff like that. But I actually don't do as well with creative type of work, like either writing or like writing exercise programs for people, because I'm almost in like a hyper vigilant state in the morning where I kind of like shut down my own ideas too quickly and sort of can't flow with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's super interesting.
So I know that I try to sort of segment my day based upon when I'm able to do the type of work that I want to do. And try to shove stuff that's lower cognitive load as far as just like administrative tasks, emails, all that kind of stuff in spots that don't really require as much, either that sort of like connect the dots type of thinking or a more like creative, like loose type of thinking. And I certainly wouldn't say anything about exercise's capacity to like change or modify any of that. But as far as the discussion on like energy throughout the day, that's at least, I think, like a starting point for like what we might be referring to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely at least very interesting.
Yeah. It's I'm sure there's plenty of people who have done research on like all those different kinds of cognitive processes and like how they function relative to other ones and what actually helps people improve certain areas over others.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Another thing that I tell myself about why staying nominally fit would be valuable for someone like me is extending healthy longevity. Is that also a thing?
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess that's sort of something you address. It's almost kind of just like another applied thing. Like I would apply my fitness to the ability to excel at a sport. I could apply my fitness to just being able to like move in the basic ways that day-to-day life requires over a longer period of time. Maybe it's almost just like the same type of answer then.
Well, I think that you're starting to get at something that is interesting, though, which is the distinction between types of training that are beneficial for different types of goals, right? That trying to get maximum longevity or like maximum healthy lifespan or whatever is not necessarily the same thing as trying to perform at your best. And I mean, I've talked about that before, right? And I think most people have some intuition about that, where it's like, guess what? Playing in the NFL might not actually be good for you. Like, and winning an Ironman triathlon, like that might not actually be good for you, right? That there may be consequences to that level of training and pushing yourself over time that are not beneficial to your maximum healthy lifespan. And that, that on the flip side of that, the things that might maximize your longevity might not be what you want as an individual for your own fitness, right? You might not be as strong as you want or as aesthetically pleasing as you want or whatever if you're trying to restrict your calories all the time. And,
Yeah, I was actually about to ask about that. I think that I've heard that one of the theories for how to live longest is to just eat a really small amount.
Yeah.
That obviously could have trade-offs with like quality of life and other things, right?
So I would say I'm not really an expert as far as like this stuff goes, but there's a lot of confusion there surrounding what is actually beneficial in animal models of longevity and what actually works in like human subjects, right? That in animal models, the severe calorie restriction does seem to work quite well, but that hasn't necessarily carried over to human beings. I will say that my kind of sense of what matters, which is not necessarily, I don't know. I wouldn't say that I feel very confident in my ability to like discuss this in detail or back it up, is more the idea of kind of swinging back and forth between different states, right? As far as like calorie restriction or like training or not training or all that kind of stuff. That you get a lot of benefit from being in a fasted state for a little while, and you get a lot of benefit from then sort of counteracting that with like a more like anabolic overfed state with a lot of training, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So that sort of swinging back and forth between these different modes of being, quote unquote, seems to be pretty beneficial for humans. So it's not as simple as just restrict your calories. It's like, okay, you should probably restrict your calories sometimes and then also not restrict them sometimes, right? That you should train really hard sometimes and you should not train really hard sometimes. And again, I think that there's trade-offs there too, as far as, what do you actually want? Do you want to truly maximize your longevity? Do you want to truly maximize your performance? Or do you really want a combination of the two? And I think that a lot of people want a combination of the two. And it's almost like an asset allocation type of situation, right? Where when you're younger, you probably want more performance, more aesthetics, all that kind of stuff. And then as you get older, your desires kind of shift and you're sort of trying to plan ahead a little bit, right? Where it's like, okay, how much do I want to trade off what I'm doing now for what I will probably want in the future?
Yeah. That's a great point. Okay. So is it reasonable to characterize it that like if I want zero allocation towards performance meaning like doing well at some applied activity or whatever, then I'm all in on health, that is going to mean increases in mood and alertness and motivation, ability to achieve certain cognitive tasks. And then probably also like at least a decent amount of extension of my healthy longevity, or might there be trade-offs between like mood and alertness now for longevity later? I mean, is that even a thing that you like think about?
Yeah.
Or can people like, do we have data or even anecdotal stuff to go to base that sort of thing on?
Sure. And again, I would say that this is not something I'm like super confident in, but I would guarantee you there is going to be some sort of trade-off between like maximizing your current mental performance and like maximizing your longevity. Right. And again, you're sort of looking at, okay.
Is that because you have to do kind of weird stuff to maximize your longevity?
Well, again, I think that it's a little bit unclear as far as what's actually like the most beneficial thing for increasing longevity. But, doing things like restricting calories will make you not perform as well cognitively.
Oh.
Right? Yeah. I mean, and I'm assuming we're not even talking about like weird biohacking stuff, right? Because you can obviously like, I'll just like take a bunch of modafinil and focus like a crazy person. It's like, okay,
right. Yeah. I was leaving that stuff out.
Yeah. So,
modafinil is the Air Force drug that is supposedly popular in Silicon Valley.
Right. Yeah. So sort of like, excluding those kind of like short-term hacks or like drugs or whatever. I would imagine that there is going to be some sort of trade-off between maximizing the performance of anything compared to what is the most beneficial thing for kind of like long-term. But I certainly wouldn't feel super confident in talking about that. But I think that also, as far as a framework for discussing what we even mean by longevity, right? I think that I think Peter Attia sort of talks about things in these terms of like, okay, well, what is most likely to kill you, and how do you sort of prevent that from happening to you?
Okay.
Right. So essentially, what's probably going to kill you? Well, for most people, it's probably going to be heart disease, cancer, or some sort of like Alzheimer's type of condition. Right. Those are the things that tend to kill people.
Do you know the stats on that? Like, does that include non-illness related deaths? Like, do you know where like auto fatalities fits in there?
Sure. Yeah. I don't know the actual stats, but I'm reasonably confident that once you get past, like, well, it depends on how you segment it too, by like age group, all that kind of stuff. Right.
Yeah.
But once you get past,
5-year-olds don't die from heart disease.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Once you get past whatever the age is where you tend to die of like accidents and all that kind of stuff, that those are the main killers, right? Like heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's. So, okay, well, which of those are you at the most risk for? And is there something that you can do to reduce that risk for yourself? Is probably a good way of thinking about it. And so I can use myself as an example, right? I am someone who has a history of heart disease in my family. I have pretty dramatic familial hypercholesterolemia, so I have pretty elevated blood lipids. I don't have the gene mutations that tend to make people more at risk for Alzheimer's. I do have a family history of cancer on my mom's side, but don't have the gene markers for that either. Right. So, okay, well, heart disease is pretty obviously my major risk. Mm-hmm. So is there something that I can do to actually reduce my risk of heart disease? Yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff, right? I've cut my saturated fat in my diet down quite a bit. I have been meeting with a lipidologist, and I'm just starting to take a statin like preventatively because my blood lipids are so high, which, there's a lot of controversy around that, but that's at least like a starting point to kind of start the process of exploring other therapies and all that kind of stuff, since it's kind of the standard of care. But that would be how I would approach that sort of thing.
Are you all currently taking a statin?
I literally just started.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't really want to do it, but it's like that's the standard of care. So if you're going to do something other than that, you kind of have to start with taking a statin.
I don't know this standard of care framing.
Yeah, so like insurance companies and doctors and all that kind of stuff sort of have agreed upon standards for like, for this, here's what you do.
Okay.
Right. So for like highly elevated blood lipids, like take a statin is the thing that you do. Okay. So you kind of have to like go through that process in order to do something else, right? So for me, my actual issue that I'm more concerned about is something called lipoprotein a, which is like a specific variant of LDL cholesterol that some people tend to make a lot more of. And I have just like dramatically elevated levels of that. My LDL cholesterol is high. It kind of varies. I can seemingly control it by reducing saturated fat, but it still tends to be a little bit high. But statins don't tend to work well for lipoprotein a, but something called a PCSK9 inhibitor does. But that's a newer drug that is really only available to people who have, at least as far as getting it covered by insurance, by people who have a specific gene variation. So my goal over time would be to maybe be on a PCSK9 inhibitor, but my understanding is I kind of have to start with the statin and like see how I react to that, do an additional genetic test to see if I qualify for the PCSK9 inhibitor, and then go from there.
Huh. Cool. Okay. Man, I'm tempted to ask some kind of weedsy questions about that, but I think we're a little bit far afield from the original idea. Okay, so that's all really interesting. One thing that might be interesting though is that, so like that was a discussion about longevity, right? But there's also this idea of healthy longevity, right? Which is like, so maybe there's some period of like 10 to 20 years towards the end of your life where you're wheelchair bound or like really not very mobile, but you're still able to keep yourself alive through medicine. But before that, there's a period where you're like not super creaky and you can like do things like jog up a flight of stairs or like, bend over to pick things up, whatever, right? You're just like mobile and able to move around. So I'm pretty interested in extending that phase of my life, right? And I mean, that seems like an obvious application for exercise and like diet, nutrition, all your stuff, right? Do you have thoughts on how like different things that you think about and advise on could apply towards extending a person's healthy longevity?
Yeah, so I think the concept there that you seem to be getting at is mostly related to just sort of like maintaining your mobility and your independence, right? So I think the things that would be most relevant there would essentially be, can you maintain some sort of physical practice that sort of prevents you from getting to that stage where you can't get yourself around, right? And the way I would look at that, again, we're essentially looking at a trade-off here because a human organism is going to require a certain amount of consistent movement and all that kind of stuff in order to maintain ranges of motion. If you stop doing something, you tend to lose the ability to do it, right? So if you aren't regularly taking your joints through a range of motion, you will tend to lose that range of motion. If you aren't regularly doing certain types of movements, you'll tend to lose the ability to do that movement, right? So squatting or lunging or any of that type of stuff. That those movement patterns can certainly get rusty, and you can lose the mobility to do them and the strength to do them if you're not doing it regularly. So my thought process there would be, okay, can we maintain these movement patterns over time by touching on them regularly and training them enough to either improve them or keep them at a certain level? But you want to think about, okay, what is the actual stress on the organism as a whole, and how much of that stress is potentially resulting in not necessarily negative adaptation, because it can cause adaptation short term, but how much of that stress is potentially reducing the ability of that organism to maintain that adaptation over time. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. So a thing that I wanted to ask you about is that so there's Nassim Taleb has this idea of anti-fragility, right? Where like certain things respond to stress by becoming more robust, right? But obviously not everything is like that. And it seems like one of the fundamental things that makes exercise a thing that makes you healthier is that the body manifests a certain amount of anti-fragility, right? So you expose it to stressors like moving a lot or whatever, lifting a heavy object, and it reorganizes itself somehow in such a way that makes it better able to do that in the future. But a thing that I don't really know anything about and haven't really heard other people talk about is ways in which the body might just not have that. Or like, if you think about something like a physical light switch, it's a mechanical part that has just like a certain number of flips. Like you can maybe flip your light switch like 10,000 or 100,000 or a million times. And once you hit whatever that number is, it'll break. And so it's a thing I've wondered about before, are like the joints in the body like that maybe, right? Like, can I raise my arm like this, 7 million times, and then on the next time it's just going to not work the same anymore? And if that is the case, would there be some kind of like trade-off there between, fitness now versus mobility later? Is that a thing?
Yeah. So, there is some famous research on this by a guy named Stu McGill. And he essentially, to your point about like a light switch, right, sort of showed a similar mechanism in spinal discs, where it's just like, okay, if you flex and extend the spine a certain number of times, eventually the disc just sort of like ruptures and you get a bulging disc. And there seems to be some evidence to support those ideas, but I think that one of my main issues with a lot of that stuff was that it was actually done in like dead spines. It wasn't done in live spines, right? So if the organism is dead, there's definitely this.
It's kind of wild to imagine someone just like holding a spine and like waving it back and forth. Like, 3,
right, keep going.
4, 5.
Keep going. And so, in a live organism, I think that this concept that you mentioned of anti-fragility is more relevant. And I also think that, the term for that used in biology is hormesis, right? That it's some sort of negative stress short term that actually causes a positive adaptation long term,
Okay.
Right. So exercise, exercise is a hormetic type of situation. A lot of antioxidants, quote unquote, in food are hormetic in the sense that the antioxidant, like an antioxidant rich food like chocolate or whatever is actually essentially poisoning your body slightly, but then eliciting a response that actually has a net like anti-oxidant or anti-inflammatory impact. Right. So a lot of stuff that's healthy, quote unquote, is actually stuff that is challenging a system and causing it to respond. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that we're looking at a trade-off here as well if we're trying to maximize longevity or longevity of joints as far as, okay, if you don't do anything, then the joint kind of like shuts itself down. Right. So if you don't move it, it will lose the ability to move. You'll lose motor control and all that kind of stuff. Right. If you move it too much, you can very easily essentially overcome the ability of the tissue to adapt to stress. Right. So like every tissue in your body has some level of stress past which it will just like break down. Right. And that can either be an acute stress as far as like, okay, if the amount of shear force on your knee when you get tackled in this position is too much, so your ligaments just pop. Or it can be kind of like cumulative stress over time, right?
So you can increase your body's capacity to receive shear force on the knee. Is that what you're saying?
You could probably do that, but that's not really what I was saying. I was referring more to like an acute injury, right? Where it's like, okay, if you stress this knee joint at this angle with this many pounds of force, you will tear your ACL.
Right.
Right. And there's a threshold past which it's like, okay, you have an acute tissue injury. Right. There's also kind of stress over time, which can also result in injury or like dysfunction in a joint. Right. So if you are stressing a joint over time, then it can essentially break down. And what are the variables that actually go into that? Well, some of it just has to do with like the overall training load. So like how much, force are you putting into this joint? I guess a term that I like is centration of the joints, which is from like the DNS folks. So it's like a specific school of rehab from Prague. So they refer to joint centration essentially as like the joint being in a neurologically optimal position, right? So if a joint is in a good position, not only do you distribute the load through the joint better amongst like the connective tissue and the muscles and all that kind of stuff, but you also neurologically have better control over it. Right. So it's kind of like a feedback and feed forward mechanism where it goes in both directions. Right. So a well-positioned joint better distributes the load throughout the joint and better activates the appropriate like stabilizing muscles and all that kind of stuff.
This might be kind of hard to do in audio, but could you explain or give an example of what a well-positioned joint might be?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, let's take something with more mobility than another joint, right? It's like a shoulder joint, right? So essentially a shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint. So I'm kind of like making a fist with one hand and like a C-shaped cup with another. And you want that ball to be set well in the socket, right? Like that's what you want to happen. If that,
what does it mean for it to be set well?
Yeah. So if it's set such that it's not centered in the socket or it's like bumping up against the bottom or the top or like too far out of the socket or too far in, you potentially have like points of contact that are not ideal. And you also, sort of what I was saying is you end up with improper coactivation of the muscles that are connected to that joint. Right. So the ball,
improper coactivation of the muscles?
So the ball being in the right spot helps your brain activate the right muscles to keep it there. So it kind of goes both directions, right? So if the ball is out of position, you have a hard time using the right muscles to stabilize it. And also, if you're using the right muscles to stabilize it, the ball is more likely to be in the right position. So it kind of goes both directions, right? So
my shoulder, incidentally, does kind of like pop out sometimes. Is that related to what we're talking about?
Maybe, right? So you are someone who is hypermobile. So you have excess range of motion in your connective tissue, which puts you in a position. So for listeners, John can do like weird, freaky stuff where he like pops his shoulders around and like can, fold his joints in half and all this kind of stuff. It's like a little bit creepy.
I don't know if I can do it like to that extreme a degree, but I generally can do some stuff like that. Most people can't.
Right. Yeah. So you have less like tension in your connective tissue than most people. And then based upon that, people who are hypermobile tend to have like weird compensatory movement strategies that they've developed to attempt to stabilize their joints. So you have less of the I guess like force from your connective tissue keeping your joints where they belong. So you end up like doing weird stuff with like your scapula or your spine or whatever to keep your joints where they belong, or to find stability where there isn't any, which can then also result in situations where, the joint kind of like clunks or like does something that doesn't feel quite right.
Yeah. Okay. That tracks with my experience.
Yeah. And especially for a lot of hypermobile people, they sometimes feel like they're tight, even though they have a ton of range of motion, because you've developed a strategy to restrict your range of motion because your brain on a subconscious level can tell that the joint isn't stable. So we'll do like a weird thing to like lock it down.
This is a thing you've told me about a little bit that I find pretty interesting and don't think I fully understand. So I think I asked you one time about stretching.
Yes.
And why it was valuable. And I think you said something about it being like a kind of reset for what your body thinks it can do with a movement. Is that a reasonable way of describing that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll explain briefly probably what I was trying to say with stretching, and then I'll sort of circle back to the idea of wearing out joints. So for stretching, I think that stretching just doesn't work the way that most people think it does, right? So the sort of layperson understanding of stretching is like, my muscle is tight, much like a piece of, I don't know, like much like a rubber band. And if I just kind of like stretch it,
yeah. My lay
out.
sense of it is that my muscle is bunched.
Yeah.
And I'm going to unbunch it a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And so it doesn't work that way, right? So essentially your nervous system controls your range of motion, right? So your nervous system tells you how long it will allow the muscles to be and what ranges of motion it will allow your joints to go into, right? There's obviously mechanical limits to that, but like a classic example would be the splits, right? There's no actual like tissue crossing there that would stop you from doing the splits. So the only reason you can't do the splits is because your nervous system recognizes that the amount of tension on your adductors as you try to drop into it is like inappropriate, and it like locks them down and prevents it from happening.
What does it mean to lock them down? Like it just prevents like
it creates like a feeling of tightness. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yep.
And so is this kind of like so my understanding of the sensation of fatigue is that it's something sort of like this, right? Where like your body can do a lot more before you drop dead, but that there's some kind of like subconscious or like nervous system level stuff that kicks in that just like makes you really not want to through various sensations.
Yes. Is
this like a related idea?
Yes. Okay. Right. So yeah, to that point, right? If your body temperature starts to get to a certain point, or you start to get enough hydrogen ions in your bloodstream or whatever, that sets off signals that create this like massive sensation of fatigue, where you start to like fail at doing stuff, even though the actual like the physiology could do more.
Yeah.
Right. So to your point about stretching, what I was probably saying is that, you're not unbunching your muscle. You're essentially training your nervous system that it's okay to be in a certain position. Like that's like what stretching is. It's like, hey, it's okay. It's okay to be here. It's all right. You can let this happen.
Cool. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Why does doing lifts make your nervous system think it's not okay to be in a position?
You mean like lifting weights makes you tight?
Yeah.
Quote unquote.
Yeah.
I just don't think that's true.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I just don't think that's a real thing.
Okay.
I do think there are plenty of people who lift weights who are tight, but it's just not an actual
thing. There's not like a one-to-one correlation there. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, well, so what may be going on there is potentially that, particularly in people doing like old school bodybuilding types of protocols with a lot of like isolation types of situations, right? That they may end up with a lot of muscle mass, but not actually taking their joints through ranges of motion, and that individual can be sort of like very muscle bound and immobile. I do also think that for people who...
And so then people observe that person. They say, look, these two things happened at the same time, where there's this person covered with muscle and like their arms don't really move, but it wasn't the case that one caused the other.
Yeah, I would say that's probably not the case, right? I would also say that there's definitely situations, let's say in like the extremes of powerlifting or something like that, where you're developing like callousing on your bones, right? Where you're essentially like turning your bones into like giant calluses that can support like literally 1,000 pounds on your back. That there may be some movement restriction.
That's a thing.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, right. Because the load is such that it's actually damaging the bone and then creating adaptation on the bone level to be able to support the load. Right.
Wow.
So there's probably some point on that trajectory where you are actually restricting your range of motion by adapting your body to being able to lift that much load. But for most individuals, it's like you're not.
Yeah, that's not right. That's not what most people are
that's
experiencing.
Not what you're doing. Yeah. But to that point also, I do think that there are a lot of people who have certain types or tendencies of movement dysfunction, and then training can exacerbate that as well. Right. So let's say a good example might be someone who, this is something we see a lot in CrossFit athletes, where they have sort of like very restricted shoulder range of motion in certain planes, right? So they struggle with shoulder extension, which is the ability to pull your arm back behind your body. And then based upon them as an individual, they also tend to have a lot of tightness in the musculature surrounding the scapula as well as the bicep, right? So they have like poor motor control of the scapula and of the shoulder, and a lot of like tight muscles in the bicep and the certain like scapular rotators. And then through the process of training and continuing to load those muscles, they can essentially reinforce those patterns repeatedly by doing something badly. Right. So I think you can reinforce bad patterns through training that can make you tighter than you otherwise would be, but it's not like increasing your muscle mass or training makes you tight. Does that distinction make sense?
Mm-hmm. What is tightness? That's just like not having done a motion until your brain stops thinking you can.
Yeah. Well, so
your nervous system.
Yeah. We probably have a lot of layers to kind of unpack as far as like what is tightness. Cause like, there's a difference between felt tightness and actual restriction. Right. Okay. So what you feel as tight may or may not be tight.
So felt tightness is the nervous system thing we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Actual tightness is a thing that happens in muscles, and
sure. So
it's like the bone calluses and stuff.
Well, so in terms of making something like inordinately complex, felt tightness for people can come both from a muscle being long or a muscle being short, right? So if you think about a muscle,
are you talking about like physiological variation between individuals?
No, I'm talking about like the muscle being in a position relative to sort of its ideal set point of either being too long, quote unquote, or too short, right? So the relative position of a joint can either shorten a muscle or lengthen a muscle, right? So if you think about...
how would that play out in a specific joint?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's use an obvious example of, what would be an easy thing, like a pull-up, right? So if you're hanging in the bottom of a pull-up, your bicep is long, right? Because your elbow is at extension, and then you shorten the bicep as you pull up on top of the bar, and then the bicep is in flexion and it's short, right? Okay. So if you think about, what is the ideal set point for your bicep? I don't know what it actually is, but one can imagine where the elbow is always like hyperextended and the bicep is sort of like set long. And if you just do that yourself, if you hyperextend your elbow, provided you can, you may actually feel some tension in your bicep, right?
Gotcha.
And then if you have the bicep set short, right, and you sort of like flex your bicep, then it obviously feels tight there too, right? So there's a point of length that feels uncomfortable and tight, and then there's a point of shortness that feels uncomfortable and tight. So when people feel a muscle as tight, it may or may not be short. Sometimes it's long.
Gotcha.
Right. And so the relative position as far as like set point of people's joints can either have muscles set in long or short positions. Right. So you can have your pelvis rotated such that you may feel like your hip flexors are quote unquote tight, but one of them may actually be short and the other may be long.
If someone says like my shoulders are tight, can you make a guess about what they're normally referring to?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that for someone like that, I would ask a lot of questions, right? Because my shoulders are tight could mean, well, what does that mean? Like, do you feel like your neck is tight? Do you feel like your actual like shoulder is tight? Do you feel like your scapula is tight? Does it pinch when you do something? What's going on there?
Yeah. And the back is like a notorious place where there are a bunch of complex interconnected pieces that can cause weird cascading downstream problems and stuff, right?
Yes, exactly. Yep. But so, and actually to circle back on the point earlier that I was making about wearing out your joints, I don't remember exactly where I got to on that. But I think essentially what you're trying to find there is the appropriate balance as far as how much can you stress this specific joint such that you're creating adaptation with it or maintaining range of motion. And that past that, you may be pushing into a territory where you are stressing it such that there may be a negative consequence to it at some point, right?
What are the negative consequences?
Well, so that depends again, right? So are you going to potentially create some sort of situation where you may have like an acute tissue damaging injury, right? Like, are you setting yourself up such that, over time you've delaminated your disc and at some point it's just going to pop? or you sort of like, irritated a certain area of cartilage or a ligament enough that if you sort of fall on it the wrong way, that something's just going to pop or tear or whatever, right? So that's an issue.
Okay.
Or just kind of developing like long-term irritation, right? Like that you've sensitized a certain attachment or something, or sort of by being repeatedly in a bad position, like worn out the cartilage in a specific area such that it's going to give you problems, right? And that you're trying to balance that, because if you don't train it and you don't use the range of motion, you will lose it, which will then potentially cause other problems at other joints because you don't have range of motion where you quote unquote should. But with the training process, you are essentially, if you push past a certain point of stressing a joint, you are making it at higher risk to have some sort of like wear and tear, quote unquote, or more of like an acute event. And where that exact sweet spot is difficult to, just give a general guideline on, but that's sort of the trade-off that you're making, right? Not using your joints is a problem. Overusing them is a problem. Joints don't wear out in the way that people necessarily think of, but you can.
But you can
essentially
you can over misuse. Is that an accurate way to characterize it?
Yeah, sure. Well, and I think that also, through the aging process, which is essentially just like degenerating into chaos and entropy, right? That like you are going to at some point like have cartilage problems in your joints. Like it's just going to happen as you get older. And by training,
unless we reach the singularity.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Unless Aubrey de Grey is right about whatever. Right. So, that's going to happen. So by training, you're trying to find, what, if anything, is a spot that I can train this joint so that I either delay that process as much as possible, or I increase the resilience of the tissue to stress.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the threshold is as far as aging goes either, where you sort of lose the ability to continue to quote unquote get better compared to what your actual potential is, but that's out there somewhere too, right? Those curves cross somewhere and like you're not getting better past this point.
Yeah.
You're basically just trying to stave off like a problem.
Okay. So those are really helpful and interesting and useful heuristics. It segues nicely into another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that if I'm just some random person who's maybe consumed some information like this, how would you recommend going about applying these ideas, right? I mean, like, if I want to figure out like a way to work out for me, obviously the best thing is like find a knowledgeable trainer, but even that is sort of a hard thing to know how to do, right? Sure. So I guess the broad set of questions I'm interested in here are like, how do I figure things out? What can I trust? How do I know who I can trust? Things like this.
Yeah, sure. And that's really hard.
Okay.
And especially,
I suppose it's kind of like a fundamental question that has dogged humanity for its entire existence.
But I actually think it's different and worse now with the access to information, right? And especially the kind of, Red Queen race of people like understanding what actually gets people to do stuff, which is not necessarily actually in their best interest, right? That a lot of the information that is successful.
Wait, hold on. I'm not sure what you mean. I haven't read the Red Queen or whatever.
Oh, sure. Well, so the Red Queen analogy is essentially, it's from Alice in Wonderland, and it's like, okay, you're sort of like chasing something, but not actually getting anywhere, right? That it's like it's essentially an arms race where you're just always like trying to get ahead of the thing, and then the thing adapts to where you're at, and then the next thing happens, right? So,
yep. Okay.
And
so like a race to the bottom, but the relevant endpoint isn't necessarily the bottom, and there isn't even necessarily a bottom.
Yeah, and what I'm referring to is specifically with like social media stuff, right? Particularly in fitness, that the stuff that people respond to is not actually the stuff that is like helpful or beneficial to them most of the time.
Sure.
Right. So not only now is there an excess of information, but the stuff that tends to do well is often something
that is
optimizing
for something else.
Yeah, optimizing not for the actual solution that will help people, but for a way to get them to engage with it.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds right.
Right. And that's not to say that there isn't good information out there, because there's also a lot of really good stuff.
For sure. Right.
But a lot of stuff that people will find is not, depending on the sort of avenues that they're searching and what their filters are, is like not actually helpful or good.
Sure.
So I think it's particularly dangerous, to go down like rabbit holes on YouTube or Instagram, because you just have people optimizing for, like you said, like the wrong thing.
Right.
Well, not necessarily the wrong thing, but they're not optimizing for giving someone something that will actually help them.
Yeah. Right.
So to I guess start to give some sort of answer for that, the things that matter are much less complicated than a lot of the stuff that we're talking about.
Okay.
Right. So the thing that matters the most is consistency. So
okay.
Right. For most people, the stuff that matters is sort of like going from 0 to 1. Like, are you doing nothing? Great. Do literally
That's
anything.
great. Right. Okay.
Right. Like, most people are doing nothing. Do absolutely anything. Like, that is better. It doesn't matter if it's like stupid and wrong. It doesn't matter if it's based upon like a flawed training methodology. It doesn't matter if it's not hard enough. It doesn't matter if it's too hard. Like, anything is better than nothing. Right. So like, that's important. And then the other aspect is having some form of consistency, because people are just not consistent at all. Right. That you will have better results doing anything 3 to 4 times per week for 9 months than you will doing the right thing for 3 weeks and then quitting.
Okay.
Right. So the goal is, how do you get yourself from doing nothing to doing anything? And then how do you figure out what will enable you to continue to train? So, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is interesting and relevant, but like, that's what actually matters. Yeah. Do anything, do it with some consistency. Because again, once you start doing it, then you start to figure stuff out, right? Then you start to have like questions and problems that need to be solved. And then, most people then start to figure things out. Oh, okay. Well, why does this happen? Like, why am I not losing weight? Why am I gaining weight? Why does my shoulder hurt, et cetera? And then once you start figuring those things out, you're on like a positive trajectory. And the training habit in and of itself often results in better habits surrounding sleep, nutrition, stress management, et cetera.
Yeah, this is actually something I want to put a pin in. A thing you've told me before that I find really helpful is that there are these different domains of health, and that it's not just, like exercise performance or whatever, that something like stress reduction or sleep, getting a sufficient amount of sleep at night, are equally important. Is that something you could elaborate on a little bit?
Yeah. Well, so,
and maybe you've gone into depth about this in other pods.
Sure. No, but essentially, if you're thinking about, okay, how can I maximize my performance or my longevity or my health or whatever, that you're sort of looking at, all right, what is my training like? What is my nutrition like? What is my sleep like? What is my stress management like? And then kind of like a fifth bucket as kind of like, what is my social connection type of situation? Right? Those seem to be the 5 big buckets that actually impact people's like health, longevity, and performance. So
with a sort of 6th meta bucket, which is just consistency or something, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That having a consistent practice surrounding all of those, again, is more important than like the actual details of what you're doing.
So wait, I'm just going to repeat those.
Yeah.
Training.
Yes.
Sleep.
Yep.
Stress reduction.
Yep.
Diet, nutrition.
Yep.
And social connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's maybe more like a emotional well-being one. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, you could probably try to parse that out in a few different ways, but the thing it seems to be is like being part of a community, right? That seems to be an independent predictor of longevity. And that so people who are parts of communities tend to do much better overall than other people.
Does the term community have a special meaning here? Like, does it mean something distinct from like having several deep friendships or something, right?
I'm actually not sure. I don't
like, I mean, you and I have like experiences with various like quote scenes, right?
Sure.
Which is this thing where there's like, you have a large number of loose connections or something, right? Like it would be interesting if that particular phenomenon had a strong impact on a person's like well-being beyond just like individual deep emotional connections.
My intuition would be yes. And I don't actually know enough about this to be super confident with it, but my intuition would be that the important thing is like feeling like you're belonging to a group, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of these studies are related to like religious groups, right? Like specific religious sects, or like people who are in like small towns that have an actual community surrounding the town.
Yeah.
And I assume that you can probably get a similar thing of like being part of a music scene, or like a technology scene, or like an improv group or whatever, that being part of that type of group.
Do you need a well-defined enemy that you can all rally around in your sense of hatred?
Yes. The dark side, the dark side of community. But again, I wouldn't be super confident in that answer, but that's what I would lean towards.
Cool. It's interesting. I had not thought about that in those terms before. Okay, cool. So that answers my pillars of health question.
Yeah. Well, and I think kind of what you're getting at with that is, we spend a lot of time focusing on training, but that's actually not necessarily the highest bang for your buck activity, right? For a lot of people, nutrition is a more relevant aspect of actually getting the results that they want, whether that's body composition change or improved focus or health and longevity, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Then nutrition is probably just, if you had to do one or the other, nutrition is probably a better lever to pull for a lot of that stuff.
Interesting.
Right? Not for performance, but for those other things.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, nutrition consistency is like the most impossible thing. They just like can't figure out how to do what they say they're going to do. But the training in and of itself improves adherence to diets. That people do a better job of eating what they know they're supposed to eat if they are training consistently. So sort of anecdotally, I find that people exercising consistency, people having consistency in their exercise program breeds consistency in their other areas, their other pillars, so to speak.
Huh. Specifically nutrition or all the other ones?
All the above, right? Huh. I mean, so I think part of the reason why CrossFit is, so successful in actually getting change for people is because it kind of like attacks all of those fronts, right? It's like, all right, like you have an exercise routine that you do with a group of people who sort of become your friends and you identify as like quote unquote CrossFitters. There's some nutrition prescription associated with it. So a lot of people at least have an awareness of like, okay, maybe I should do something, when you're exercising consistently and you've potentially improved your diet, then sleep tends to fall into place. Right, that you have, that I think a lot of sleep issues for people are related to dysregulation of the circadian rhythm and like dysregulation of their stress response throughout the day.
Are you talking specifically about people with insomnia?
I would
imagine for a lot of people, there's almost more like a logistical or scheduling piece or something, right, where they're just so busy that they only tell themselves or something that they have time for 5 or 6 hours of sleep at night.
Right. Well, but if you look at what those people are actually doing, it's like, yo, come on.
3 hours of Instagram.
Yeah, like what are you actually doing? Come on, give me a break. But no, I was referring more to like circadian rhythm aspects of it, right? So if you work out at the same time and eat at the same time, then your body tends to fall into a rhythm relative to the day-night cycle, and you will get tired at a certain time. Right? So it's much easier to sleep well if you are tired when you should be. Right? You can obviously still screw that up in a lot of ways, like working late, watching too much TV at night, like all that kind of stuff can obviously dysregulate that circadian rhythm.
Stimulants in the evening.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Like all that stuff like messes people up. But for a lot of people, by having an exercise habit and then funneling that into some sort of like improved nutrition, you're essentially establishing a circadian rhythm, which will then make you tired when you should be tired. So people tend to sleep better based upon that.
That makes sense. What about stress reduction?
Yeah, well, and I think that, like we talked about with joints, right, that you can improve your overall ability to tolerate stress and handle it by stressing yourself appropriately. So doing something training is a consistent dose of stress that can improve your overall ability to handle stress, right, provided it's not excessive. And a lot of people go down the rabbit hole of training way too much and end up having it be too much of a stress to actually give them benefit, right? Or people start doing weird stuff like they need to go to the 5 a.m. workout class, so they are getting 4 hours of sleep because they decide they're getting up at 4:15 every morning and whatever. It's like, okay, well maybe it's better for you to actually sleep than work out today. Like go home. Sure. And there's obviously
you probably end up with like type A people that tell themselves they're not good enough to be right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You start to get down some like weird disordered stuff of people like punishing themselves through exercise or like hating themselves and like feeling like they're not good enough, just like dark stuff. But that, that's obviously, those are kind of like edge cases. Mm-hmm. But for most individuals, having a regular training practice improves the overall resilience and robustness of themselves as organisms to just like stress in general. So, okay, you've improved your ability to tolerate.
You suffered for like 20 to 60 minutes per day, 3 days a week or something, right?
Yeah, and I think it's not just like the psychological aspect of like, this is hard and I don't want to do it. And I sort of learned to override that, as well as just the overall, the body processes stress pretty similarly from different sources, right? So like the overall stress system.
Wait, maybe we should do like a lowercase b philosophical discussion of what stress is.
Sure. Again, this is something that I wouldn't feel totally confident in, like, being very detailed, and I'll probably say some stuff that's a little bit wrong. But essentially,
stop the podcast.
Yeah, it's over. It's over. But no, the overall concept is that you have a stress response system, right, which is essentially adapted to give you what you need to make it through like certain events or occurrences, right? Okay. And that whether the stress...
This is like the sort of anecdotal grandmother lifts the car off the person in a car accident or whatever.
Sure, right? I mean, that can be an extreme example of that, right? That if you get like a massive jolt of adrenaline, that you can do seemingly, super physiological things, right? Mm-hmm. But that we have a stress response that physiologically is very similar, whether it's exercise or, being in traffic or being in a meeting where you're giving a presentation you don't want to and you're unprepared, or like having an argument with a significant other, that the actual physiological response to those is not exactly the same, but it shares a lot of fundamental physiology.
What are some of those similarities, or is that way too like? Yeah, I mean,
I would say I wouldn't want to like dig into that too deep without pulling up some stuff, because I'll just say wrong things. Okay. Right. Okay. But essentially, you have a stress system that is it's like a teeter-totter of you have.
I mean, could we say like at least on a basic level that it's I'm guessing like neuroendocrine system stuff, like hormones get released and like something happens in your nervous system.
Yes.
And that those things probably produce recognizable physiological changes. Like, I don't know if this is actually one of them, but maybe you get like flushed.
Yes.
Or
like
for sure. Blood pressure raises. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it's actually extremely...
And that stuff happens during a workout. Is that right?
Yes. Well, and it's also it gets really complicated because a lot of stress responses can be paradoxical depending on the severity and the duration of it.
What do you mean?
So stress can both. So a good example would be memory, right? Stress can either cause you to like forget stuff, or it can make things like very salient in your memory. And that sort of depends on the duration and the intensity of the stress response, and then you as an individual, which aspects of those things are like most robust physiologically, right? And so again, I don't remember all the details of how this works, but essentially memory is encoded in the hippocampus, and then depending on the type of stress response, it can either like improve that encoding or it can disrupt it. Right? So you end up with a lot of potentially paradoxical responses to stress. Appetite is one. Some people are starving when they're stressed, other people can't eat. Okay. Right? And for an individual, it can change too, again, depending on the situation, the duration, the intensity, et cetera. And that has to do with, again, I might screw up the hormones here, but one aspect of the cascade of the cortisol releasing cycle is actually like pro-appetite, and then the other aspect is anti-appetite. So it's like, okay, well, which aspect of that cycle is dominant for you? Where are you in that overall cycle, et cetera? So you can end up with some like very confusing physiology surrounding stress that can be counterintuitive for people and can actually have like literally the opposite reactions, right? But again, all these stresses share, at least on some level, the same physiological process that's going on. Okay. So by making yourself more resilient to stress by either training, right, exercising, or meditating, or whatever, provided this dose response is appropriate, you, I think, globally increase your ability to be resilient to stress.
And when we talk about resilience to stress, is that primarily cognitive? Like my body is undergoing this thing, but my brain remains a certain degree of equanimity or whatever? Or are you talking about, is there like a physiological component to that too? Like the hormonal cascade is less intense or something?
Well, I think it's both, right? And when I'd also say it's not necessarily less intense. Ideally what you want to happen is you want your stress response to be, binary might not be the right word, but that's kind of what came to mind, right? You want to be able to get very stressed out very quickly, and you want to be able to come back off of it immediately, right? So you want to be able to have like relatively extreme stress and then to recover right away.
You mean for training your stress response, that's what you want? Is that what you're saying?
Sure, yeah.
Or is that what you want the result of training to be?
Yeah, so both, okay. Right? So people who are really great athletes are able to mount like a very incredible stress response very quickly and then come down from it right away, right? And sort of like on a...
Does that mean that also like if they were, like in a bank and a bank robber came in, they would like freak out for a second, but then be calm?
Well, and that's actually probably an interesting scenario, right? Because in that situation, you definitely want like the heightened state of being stressed. If potentially like you had to, run or hide or like tackle someone or like whatever, right?
Duck.
You want that, but then you also want the ability to not react excessively to that, right? So, I mean, that's a more complex situation where I think you're dealing with the like physiological response to stress as well as the sort of like emotional capacity to tolerate that response, which I think that both of those are separate adaptations that are both worth having and maintaining. But I guess what I was trying to say on a more specific level is that you want the capacity to mount a pretty high stress response when necessary, but you don't want that response to last longer than is necessary, right? That's what you want to happen. Like when necessary, you want to be able to mount that very strong, like physiological response to stress. But then when the stress is over, you don't want to maintain it.
So the opposite of this is chronic low level stress.
Yes.
Which
sure.
I have heard is bad.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So that would be an example of something that is like a maladaptive stress response. It's like always being kind of stressed out and not ever really coming down from it. And then a lot of times people in that state can struggle to mount like a true, like high alert stress response as well.
Interesting. Okay.
All right. So the overall point there is that by stressing yourself regularly through training, you are training the overall, like physiological stress response to be adaptive and appropriate. You're training your resilience to that. So essentially, we were talking about like tissue resilience to stress earlier, like how much load can you put through this, how many times in a certain amount of time before it breaks. I think you can have a similar type of thought process for the overall like stress response system. Like how much stress can you put on the system before you get some sort of maladaptive response, right? And then by stressing it regularly in like controlled doses, you can make that system more robust. And then on the big picture perspective, from like a higher order cognitive type of situation, you're also training your ability to handle stress, right? That like when something is stressful, that how do you react to that emotionally? And are you able to, like still execute under pressure, or potentially, not react to a stressful situation the same way you would otherwise? And I don't necessarily think training is the best tool for all of that, but I think it's a part of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a pretty good, strong case for training.
Yeah, sure. As if anyone needs to be convinced.
Well, people who listen to your podcast regularly probably don't.
Right.
But I certainly go through phases in my life where I'm not training.
Yeah. But is that because you don't think it's valuable?
It's probably because the relevance of its value, doesn't feel very acute to me or whatever.
Right.
I mean, I think that when I stop training, I have an experience similar to the one you described earlier where you start to feel worse, but I think it either takes longer to kick in for me or it just takes longer for me to notice it. Mm-hmm. It might be sort of like a boiling a frog thing, right? Or supposedly this is really pretty cruel and gross, but
pretty sure this is just not true at all, but
yeah, right. I really hope it's just some weird fake thing. Yeah. Anyway, sometimes certain phenomena don't get responded to if they ramp up gradually over time.
Right.
I'll leave out the morbid actual frog boiling part. Yeah, cool. What do you think about the idea of a person treating themselves as a guinea pig and conducting experiments on themselves?
Sure. Well, to our discussion earlier about things that sort of catch attention, I think that's a thing that catches people's attention, right? That the sort of narrative of I'm a human guinea pig and I do this crazy stuff. You've heard about this. Let's see what actually happens when I do it, right? That's very clearly a narrative that sticks with people. And there's all kinds of examples of that in the health and fitness world, right? So there's the case of Super Size Me, where the guy ate only McDonald's for a certain amount of time. There's some counter movie to that where a guy ate McDonald's and paid attention to his calories over a certain amount of time and lost weight. There's
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily mean like these really like attention grabbing versions of that, or extreme versions of that. But like if I get curious about a different, maybe this isn't even that interesting of a question. I don't know. If I get curious about like a diet, like should I trust my ability to just like try some random other diet for 4 weeks? Yeah. Or even like 1 week or like whatever, right?
Yeah. So
like, is this, do you think that for an individual, this is a fruitful avenue of optimization of how one applies these principles?
Sure. And the answer is like a resounding no. Right. So, and this is interesting because I very much believe in like individualization, like personalization of prescriptions. But what I see happening with people when they're like, oh yeah, like I'm just going to try it and see if it works for me, like listen to your body, whatever, is that the number of people who have the wherewithal and the understanding of what's going on in order to try something and listen to their body appropriately is like 0.1%. Right? It's like, who can actually do that? Like someone who's a fucking fitness professional who's like studied this stuff and like actually pays attention to it and like really knows what's going on and is deeply familiar with the research and can kind of like manipulate variables. Right? Everyone else is incapable of being consistent, like overly reactive to like minor changes that may or may not actually be relevant, has no understanding of how much something is like noise versus an actual change, doesn't understand the big picture of why something might be recommended. So, can get lost in the weeds on like specific diets or exercise programs. So I think for most people, like screwing around with stuff and like, oh, I'll just try it and see if it works is actually just like a terrible strategy because they don't have the tools necessary to make that valuable. If someone does and they want to mess around with stuff, like awesome, that works great. But for almost everyone, they just don't. Like they just don't know enough to do it.
Well, okay.
It's like, oh yeah, like I'm just gonna like do this calculus problem. I'll just like see what works. Like, no, what? No, can't do that.
Okay. So, all right, let's say then we have a person who has applied the something is better than nothing principle, right? And they are going to the gym and they are like kind of paying attention to what they eat and whatever, improving their sleep and stress reduction. What processes should that person apply to then improve those activities?
Yeah, sure. So I think that this is a really challenging spot for people because you essentially have to be able to set goals, but be unattached to the outcome of what's happening and like be constantly iterating, right? So
set goals, but be unattached to the outcome.
Yes. And like constantly iterate.
Okay.
Right. So, and by unattached to the outcome.
This sounds like treating yourself like a guinea pig.
Sure. But I think that the guinea pig implication is like, oh, like I'm just going to try keto and see if it works for me. Oh, I'm just going to try intermittent fasting and see if it works for me. I'm going to try like CrossFit and see if it works for me, right? That approach to stuff I think is not really a good one, right? It's better to essentially like find some sort of trusted expert and just like do what they say.
Right. Okay.
Right. That like you as self-experimenter, like you don't know what you're doing and you're just like tinkering aimlessly. And then you're just kind of like screwing stuff up because you don't know. And that if you're an expert and you want to tinker, fine. But if you're not an expert, just like do what you're supposed to.
Okay. Well, what characterizes the difference between that and this like kind of non-expert variability or whatever that you advocate?
Yeah. So, well, I was referring...
Or do you think that a person at that point just needs an expert to guide them? Like a trainer and a nutritionist?
Needs, I think, is not necessarily the right word. I mean, I think if someone can... afford it and like make it part of their life, that they will have better results if they're just working with someone who can kind of like filter stuff for them and just tell them what to do. But your question was about like, okay, how do you like get better at stuff over time? Right.
Yeah.
And so I don't think the way to do that is to kind of like jump from thing to thing and like self-experiment like that, because I don't think that's a good way to do it. Right. That if we use like a business context, that's just kind of like pivoting all the time. Right. Like, oh, like we're going to make like this app, like, oh, I guess we'll turn it into a social network. Like, oh, that's not working. What if we, it's like, no, you have to kind of like have momentum and be building on something. And then if you're going to pivot, it's because you found something that is actually working way better and you're going to switch to that. like through this process of kind of like iteratively figuring it out, right? So if you are going to self-experiment, it should be based upon some sort of like iterative process with the guidance of an expert as to like what matters and doesn't matter, not just kind of like randomly picking a new thing that you heard on a podcast and trying it. Does that distinction make sense?
Yes.
But to sort of get back to the question you were asking, I think that people, the concept of goal setting is pretty prevalent, but I think it's confusing for people, and I think it causes them a lot of problems. But what's challenging is that you have an outcome that you're shooting for, but if you are emotionally attached to that outcome, then you start doing weird, bad stuff to yourself, and also, trying to get shortcuts and all those kinds of unhealthy things, right? So,
okay.
Because people will sort of self-sabotage themselves the same way that like businesses can screw up what they're doing with like faulty metrics, or people like gaming the system to get metrics.
Yeah. That's
right?
funny.
So, you may have an outcome of like, okay, I want to lose X number of pounds in this amount of time. Okay, that might be a good idea to have an idea of what you're trying to do, right? But what do you really want? Well, you want to feel the way that you feel when you've lost that amount of weight, which was what? Well, my pants fit a certain way. I felt attractive based upon, the way that my partner said something to me, or like the amount of attention I was getting, like there's whatever those metrics are that like actually indicate that you've accomplished the goal you're trying to accomplish. Okay. So that's what you want, right? It's good to have that established. And then you try to do it and you see whether or not what you're doing is moving you towards that outcome. But if you're overly fixated on it, like I need to lose this amount of weight by this amount of time, then people start doing weird stuff that isn't necessarily helpful. Like,
yeah, that makes sense.
Or just beating themselves up. Like, I'm a failure. I screwed it up again. I said I was going to do this and I didn't do it. Like, this sucks. I quit. Or just like constant negative, self-flagellation, which we kind of talked about earlier. And that can get pretty dark for people too. So it's this weird balance of having a specific outcome that you want in mind and working towards it, and trying to figure out what problems come up along the way and solving them without being emotionally invested in that outcome to the point of creating negative consequences for yourself emotionally, or like trying to do weird short circuit hacks to get there.
Yeah.
Shortcut rather than short circuit.
Intuitively, I want to say that the Zen that you're describing of like just having a good process and applying it with the ultimate knowledge that it'll lead you to like something resembling what you want, right? Might be hard for a lot of people. That a lot of people need, a concrete goal or external pressure or things like this. Do you have thoughts on how to, shift a person's mindset or desires in such a way that like just consistently applying a thing that because the process is valuable rather than like they're getting a reward or avoiding like they're getting a carrot or avoiding a stick, but just like the process itself is valuable?
Yeah, well, I think that that's something that can come for people over time, but that, you can say that to people, but they're like, okay, yeah, I get it. When am I going to have a six pack? Like it's not, and that's like a lead a horse to water type of situation, right? Like you can put that out there for people, but they're not going to necessarily understand it until they get to that point themselves kind of naturally. And then I think for a lot of people that can happen with training, especially if you find something that you like, because over time that activity in and of itself becomes inherently pleasurable, right? And you start to enjoy it. You start to like the way you feel. If it's something like weightlifting, then you start to, obsess about your technique and like start watching videos about how to get better at it, right? If it's something like CrossFit, you have a lot of numbers that you're potentially looking to improve, that those types of things can be built up over time. But that the most important aspect of that is developing enough consistency such that you start to have that type of, inherent enjoyment of that process, which then lets you, then be like, oh yeah, the process is cool. This is great. But getting to that point is the hard part for people.
Yeah. I need that for email.
I don't know if I have any tips for email.
I'm working on my email technique.
Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, that makes sense. I feel like we kind of talked about aging and longevity like weirdly more than I expected to, but I do have another thing I'm curious about relative to that. And you actually mentioned this earlier. But so my intuitive sense, what aging is that cells are always dying and reproducing, right? And that because of entropy, that process occasionally goes haywire, and just like cells reproduce as slightly worse or degraded versions of themselves over time. Would you characterize that also as being what aging is, basically?
Yeah. So again, I wouldn't say that I'm like super confident in like the details of this, but the process of aging has a lot to do with just kind of like accumulating entropy over time. Right, the stuff just like starts to get disorganized. That cells start to, accumulate errors every time they reproduce. The tissue starts to get kind of disorganized and not really set up properly. The mechanisms that kind of filter those things and correct for errors start to break down. So it's really just, it's an accumulation of entropy that results in like the sort of changes that we expect to see, like wrinkled skin and, reduced recovery from injury and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. That's what I thought. Do you have recommendations for sources people can go to self-educate on the different pillars of health? So like if someone wanted to read a book on training, or someone wanted to read a book on diet and nutrition, especially with diet and nutrition, like choosing one, I think is like a totally overwhelming thing, right? Because there are all these different like diet fads and stuff.
Right.
Or maybe do you even have maybe like a kind of like meta guidance or meta heuristic for like how to find good material in a noisy environment? Do you have any advice along those lines?
Yeah, I think that that's really, really tough. And a lot of that comes down to the psychology of the individual who is like seeking out information, right? Because people are looking for something that solves a problem that they have. Right. So people very rarely, I mean, there are some people who are going to actively seek out information for information's sake, and that their goal is like, okay, I want to understand this and build a better model of the world. And those people are probably going to be fine.
Yeah. Right? Although that's actually an interesting side question. So like, how plausible do you think it is for a curious person to just like get some books and read about like the various systems in the body and like, I don't know, organic chemistry and like the neuroendocrine system and like the gut microbiome and all this stuff, and like build up a like non-useless mental model of the body? Is that a thing that a person could plausibly do?
I mean, I would say that I've done that. So yes.
Okay.
And it doesn't seem that, to me, that's something that's like inherently enjoyable, is like seeking out information, like consuming it and trying to process it. And then like testing that, testing new ideas against existing ideas and seeing like where they break down. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very possible. I think it's hard for people for a lot of reasons, but I think that...
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think like some people will either just like want to do it or not.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. And I think that some people do have the capacity to sort of like take in information from like reading and podcasts and seminars, et cetera, and actually like learn it and apply it and develop a better mental model that they can utilize. And other people just can't seem to do that. That seems to be I don't know if it's like a binary characteristic in humans, but it's something that I've definitely noticed, that some people can do that and other people just can't, that they don't apply stuff that they learn in contexts like that. So I think for that type of individual, it's much harder to sort of self-educate.
Yeah. Okay. So for some people, that's just like not an avenue that is fruitful to pursue. And for another cohort of people, they love doing stuff like that and will just do it on their own anyways.
Yeah.
For a person who sometimes does that and sometimes doesn't, maybe, I don't know if this cohort exists, right? But someone who like kind of wants to learn about this stuff, right? Like how much of an undertaking would that be to try to build up a non-useless mental model of the way the body and its various systems work and interact? Yeah.
And I think that, it depends on like the goal of that, right? So, I mean, to use myself as an example, right, where, I've, in my formal schooling had very little information about like biology in any sort of relevant context, right? But I've read a lot of stuff and I think I have a non-useless model of how it works. But I like enjoyed that and figured it out and, continue to do so. Whereas let's say something like Photoshop, which I use intermittently and, I am confident enough to like make funny pictures, but don't actually know what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when I'm not like building a model of how Photoshop works, I'm like Googling how do I
do like ad hoc, like,
it's like, how do I do this with like this specific kind of layer? Right. Oh, okay. That's what I do. And then I do it. And if someone who actually knew how to use Photoshop watched what I was doing, they'd be like, what are you doing, man? Right. But I kind of have my like weird little things that I know how to do. And that's really it. And I'm not necessarily interested in like building up like a truly robust understanding of like the Photoshop ecosystem and like how to do stuff, you know? So I think that's that can be applied to like fitness and nutrition as well. You know, do you want to just like have solutions to the problems that you come up with, or do you want to like really attempt to master it and like build a model of the world? And that you don't need to master it and build a model of the world to like get stuff done.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good answer.
Cool. But if you wanted to, you could, right? And that if you're undergoing that process, then you're going to, you know, start to come across things that don't make sense, and you know you'll start to see, oh, okay, the solution that this person is offering is essentially them trying to give people what they want because they know that people are asking this type of question, or that it fulfills a need for like a desperate person who's like trying to, you know, come up with something that will help them accomplish like a certain weight loss goal or whatever. Mm-hmm. Right. So a lot of fitness material is essentially catered to desperate people, catered to people who are very much caught in like a hacker type of mentality of like finding a trick to get around something, or to solve like a very specific problem that someone has, who is maybe like a novice or an intermediate at doing what they're doing. And that, you know, if you're trying to really understand it, you probably need to get out of that layer.
Do you have recommendations for sources that operate at the correct layer for these domains?
Yeah, I mean, I think that,
or is that like a really time consuming undertaking? Like first you need to learn about some like fundamental concepts and then you need to build on top of them.
Well, I think it's also kind of like, almost like music stuff too, where it's like, oh, what are, you know, if you want to get into death metal, what should you do? Should you start with like what I consider to be the 5 best death metal albums of all time, right? That's a way to do it, but they're probably not accessible. Or should you start with something that's like kind of a, you know, a more mainstream, like rock based thing that has some of the trappings of death metal, but isn't necessarily, you know, like a true cult classic, so to speak, you know, and that can come up with fitness and training too, right? It's like, do you want to start trying to read Super Training, right? Which is like a fantastic book that has a lot of information, but, you know, would be just like absolutely brutal for someone who isn't like highly invested already to try to get through. I don't know.
I actually think I would recommend a specific thing for someone to get into death metal, which would be like training them to hear what metal is trying to do.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm not sure what I would pick before Slayer, but I would probably pick like Slayer and maybe get them to listen to the riffs outside of the context of the fully composed song. Because like the way that some extreme metal treats drums almost more as like a texture and vocals almost more as like a percussive component, like having all that stuff at once might be overwhelming.
Right.
I mean, this was a thing for me. That's like where it clicked, is like hearing Slayer riffs out of the full context. And I was able to understand just like the different sense of melody, right?
Yeah.
And then death metal is some kind of like intense distillation of that. Anyway, it's a little off topic.
No, but that's relevant. Well, but to kind of give an answer, I mean, we'll name a few books, right? So we'll go with stuff that isn't necessarily like totally accessible, but isn't like brutal to get through either, right? So for nutrition, I would say that Stefan Guyenet's book, The Hungry Brain, I think has a really great model of the actual like neurochemistry of appetite and obesity and all that kind of stuff. I think that Paul Jaminet's book, The Perfect Health Diet, is one of the best iterations of like the paleo concept that I've read. I'm
going to interrupt very briefly. Just point out that the name of that book is The Perfect Health Diet, not The Perfect Health Diet, which is just helpful for me for wanting to read it.
Sure. Yes.
Right, so
yes. Yeah. Got it. Yeah. Right. So the emphasis matters there.
Yeah.
As far as like energy systems training and conditioning and all that kind of stuff, there's not really a lot of great books, I would say, on this. I think Joel Jameson's book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning, has one of the best like models written down of that stuff. I think the OPEX certification is one of the best things out there as far as like more detailed breakdowns of how that might function in like a mixed modal type of situation.
That's a book?
No, OPEX does certifications.
Okay. Right, but so it would be like a course a person would take.
Yeah,
okay.
The Ultimate MMA Conditioning book, I think, is one of the better just like books on it. Cool. As far as like strength training, I think Greg Everett's book, Olympic Weightlifting, again, that's very specific to weightlifting, but I think there's a lot of really good principles for like overall strength training in that. Again, that might be a little bit of a slog for someone who isn't like deeply invested in that process.
Sure.
But I think that has some really good explanations of all that kind of stuff. From a more like movement, like physical therapy, rehab type of thing, man, I would struggle to say a book that I think is really, really relevant. I think that actually Gray Cook's book Movement is probably one of the better ones out there to kind of like explain a lot of the concepts for that. The courses that I found most beneficial are the PRI courses from the Postural Restoration Institute and DNS, the Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization folks. Some of the stress physiology that we were talking about earlier gets broken down in pretty good detail in Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So I think that would be like a good starting point.
Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.